Sir Neil.
A desire line sounds somewhat pornographic, so I'm feeling quite nervous. What, Bill, is a desire line?
So in landscape architecture, the way that they decide to put the paths. So for example, let's say we're designing a university campus. Instead of the various asphalt paths taking us, some kind of logical path, what they do is they put a few of the obvious paths, but then they don't complete the project. They bring the students on campus and they see where the grass turns brown, right? Where the people, their desired line. So we heard tonight from the governor, and the governor made very clear that he wanted to rename UATX to Austin University. And by the way, I think you laugh, okay, but I'm like a brand guy. I think it's a brilliant idea, okay? The fact that he made the mistake twice, I understand, not just tonight, but also at convocation, you have to go with the desired line. In all seriousness. So you can't have a UATX with a UT Austin and then we recruit away someone to become the new head of Austin University. And by the time we need to do this before our merch is everywhere, right? We should create some amazing merch, Austin University, and we're done. And by the way, fundraising will skyrocket. Yes.
So
I was afraid you will no longer sound like a railroad.
I was afraid you were going to suggest we call it Ackman University. So I'm kind of relieved at this point. One of the funny things about naming is, as you say, the desire line tends to dominate. I once wrote a book called The Square and the Tower. It is always referred to as the tower and the square. Nothing I can do about it. I've experienced this before. I was called Neil Ferguson until people started calling me Niall Ferguson. Are you suggesting I should just surrender to the desire line of Niall? But the funny thing is that, Bill, you're right. It can be Austin University, or it can be the University of Austin, just as it's Oxford University or the University of Oxford. I don't mind as long as we're mentioned in the same breath as Oxford. And, when you were starting out Pershing Square, what was the origin of that name? Where did your business name come from? Was there a desire line there?
Yes. My first office for my first fund was at 110 East 42nd Street, which is Grand Central Station. I'll give a 2-second story on this. And the square in front of Grand Central, before Grand Central, was called Pershing Square. And actually there's a restaurant, called Pershing Square, that we used to eat at kind of every day when I was at my old sort of company. And then when I launched my new firm, and then I did a little research on General Pershing, so-called Blackjack Pershing, who was a very brave...
I wondered about that.
...general. And so I thought, courage, obviously, bravery, and then there was a desired line, and I could show you the original floor plan. But now, the fun part of this is I was raising money for Pershing Square, and I had met with Mort Zuckerman, real estate entrepreneur, as I'm trying to gather the capital, and I had a pretty good meeting with him, and a few days later, I'm having breakfast at the Pershing Square restaurant. And the hostess comes over to the table and she said, are you Mr. Ackman? I said, yes. There's someone calling you. And basically, Mort Zuckerman's secretary looked up Pershing Square in the phone book, and she called the restaurant, which is basically a diner, and I happened to be there at the time. Ultimately, he chose not to invest.
That's because he thought you were running a restaurant. So brand confusion is easy, but this gives me the segue into an opening question. I can't have you here on stage with this great crowd of supporters without asking you about the trade war. You just went out on X a couple of days ago saying we need to pause the US-China trade war. Tell me exactly why you think that's a good idea.
My theory is as follows. 145% tariffs are basically a complete shutdown in trade with China. The repercussions for U.S. businesses, beginning with small U.S. businesses that source any meaningful amount of their product from China, is pretty much decimation. They will, they cannot mark up, think the toy retailer in Austin, buying goods for Christmas. They're done. And when you go to war, it's very important, and trade war or other war, that economically you are as powerful as you can possibly be. And this tariff actually threatens us economically and the uncertainty. And by the way, it's not just small businesses. It's medium-sized businesses, it's large businesses. It's a bit like COVID, except the Hilton survived COVID, but the guy who owned one hotel, absent the government stepping in and lending money, he was toast. And so my argument is Trump has made his point that the U.S. is going to be fierce about negotiating for various strategic and economic and other reasons. And he's accomplished that already. But what's interesting is if you take the tariffs down from 145% to 20% against China, then the ball is now the ball's in China's court. And what I mean by that is every CEO of every business that sources in China right now is desperately trying to find another alternative, move their supply chains. That's not going to change when you take tariffs from 145 to 20. They're going to be that much more motivated to do so. The longer that China takes to negotiate make a deal with the president, the higher the probability that every business leaves China on a fairly permanent kind of basis. So I think it actually, by lowering the tariffs, it makes time our friend in the negotiation and time China's enemy. Whereas right now, I think it's really the enemy of both. What's sort of fascinating about this is when we take them down, it becomes, now we have the staying power because the 10 or 20% tariff is manageable for nearly all businesses.
So when you were talking with the president about the need for the 90-day pause in the reciprocal tariffs, one argument that you could make, which was pretty compelling, was that the bond market was about to blow up. And there was this very unusual combination of a weakening dollar and rising 10-year yields. Is there an equally compelling economic argument that you can make now about the US-China tariffs, and what would it be?
The argument would be that the market is expecting a pause, in effect.
And if it doesn't get one?
It's going to be ugly. And again, you don't want to go to war. I mean, the ultimate bellwether of the U.S. economy is the stock market. You don't want to go to war with the stock market declining, with bond yields, the bond market declining, and the dollar weakening. That's a weak negotiating position, and will be perceived that way. And as we approach midterm elections, we want to stay very far away from kind of the midterms for this to be resolved, because certainly the president will lose a lot of his power in that circumstance.
Do you see how I'm getting you all free investment advice? I get one more question in this direction. There are some economists, I'm thinking of the guy at Apollo, who really think a recession is now inevitable, whatever happens, because there's so much trade policy uncertainty that even if the president takes your advice and there's a pause or they lower the tariffs on China, it's still going to happen because the shock has been administered. How do you think about that chain reaction? When do we get from financial markets being unhappy or confidence indicators moving to the real economy feeling it? How do you think about that chain reaction?
So this business fundamentally is a confidence game, right? If you're not confident in the future, every decision a CEO makes is based on a prediction about the future. To the extent the future becomes uncertain, what do people do? They pause. And they don't hire the marginal person. They don't put the shovel in the ground to build the next factory. They just, the great wait is what they do. And I think, that is actually going on. I think the second quarter is going to be meaningfully weaker than Q1. Q1 had the benefit of a lot of front-loaded purchases as people tried to get ahead of the tariffs, whether that's cars or, flat screen, sort of TVs. Q2, the pause is sort of underway. I think the only thing mitigating it is that the markets are stable. Actually, markets are up, a bit since Trump. But that will fade very quickly as if we start getting closer to the 90-day pause without some meaningfully positive announcements with respect to the reciprocal tariffs. And I also think, with the China situation resolved, now China's already showing a little leg here, right? They've eliminated the tariffs on about $40 billion worth of trade. There's been some positive kind of language. The Chinese Senate delegation very secretly to meet with Treasury Besant, and they were caught by Korean media on the way into the Treasury building. So I think all of these things have caused the expectation to be, we're going to pause, and we're going to make progress. I think if we don't, then we're going to be back in the soup, which is where we were before.
We're here to talk about higher education more than about markets. You really were the most outspoken critic of Harvard University after October 7th, 2023. Now, the Trump administration is going after Harvard really hard. How do you react to that? Do you agree with the way the administration is dealing with Harvard? And can maybe I ask you for your comments about the report that just got published by Harvard on the problem of anti-Semitism on the campus?
So first, I owe the world an apology, which is I did not realize how sick higher education was or how bad things were until October 8th. So I feel like late to the party. I made up a bit, but kind of lost time. So the question is how Trump's managed. So the problem of the Harvards of the world is people think a $53 billion endowment, I don't want to use an untoward expression, it's sort of FU money, and it creates the opportunity for university independence, but it's not actually the case. Yesterday, I read the bond prospectus for Harvard's taxable $750 million bond issuance, and a few interesting facts. So number one, Harvard has a stated $53 billion endowment, of which 80 to 85% of the assets are in private equity, real estate, and venture capital. Yale's marketing a $6 billion slice of their private equity exposure, and I guarantee you that that's the carrying value. I guarantee you that the transaction price is going to be a meaningful reduction from that number, which should cause, appropriately from an accounting perspective, Yale to have to remark their entire portfolio, and it should cause Harvard to do the same thing. Harvard's marketing a $1 billion slice of their portfolio. So one thing I believe is that the private equity portfolios, the real estate portfolios, the venture capital portfolios are mismarked. And
what's meaningful?
I would say 40% discount.
40%?
Yeah. First of all, every institution is completely full up with private equity. No one wants incremental exposure to private equity. So the next buyer cost of capital is meaningfully higher. My guess is Yale chooses not to transact, and Harvard may do the same because they don't want to report the figure. But let's just talk about, so one, the assets are invested in illiquid funds where they can't get liquidity other than by doing a secondary transaction. And the scale of these secondary transactions, there isn't enough capital interested in buying them, absent massive discounts. But it tells you what the concerns are. You say, well, how could Harvard have a problem? One, they have $53 billion endowment, which is mismarked. By the way, the marks are basically, the venture capital marks are as of the last round, which were done in probably 2021 for many of these businesses. The real estate marks are, were done before the Fed started kind of raising interest rates, and really the same, for private equity. So how has Harvard been meeting its obligations? They've been issuing debt. What's not talked about when you mention the $53 billion endowment is Harvard has $7.9 billion worth of debt. The most recent issuance was for a AAA rated institution, was in the 5% range. I mean, this is not a kind of a low sort of coupon. Now imagine you're a donor who's being cultivated by Harvard to give money. Well, where's your money going? It goes to Harvard and it goes out the door to pay interest expense to bondholders. My experience with charity or nonprofits that have large amounts of debt, it's a death spiral because the donor doesn't want to give money that they want to give to a project they don't want to give to kind of pay interest expense. Harvard relies on the federal government, on the alums' donations, and a very small liquidity pool to meet their kind of ongoing obligations, and a draw from the endowment. And each of these has been meaningfully impaired. Donors are not excited to give money to the university, and they're going to be less excited once they understand what's the financial picture. The tax exemption is at risk, which means that tax exemption benefits the institution because they get they don't have to pay taxes, but I would say more significantly, the donor gets the benefit of a meaningful tax deduction in America when we give to these institutions. That goes away. I mean, it's a disaster. So they're under, I would say, quite severe financial pressure. Now, if you read, there were two letters from the administration. There was one on like April 7th, and there was a mistaken one, supposedly on April 13th. They both basically said the same thing. The first was actually quite fair. The second, I would call it a bit, what you might call overreaching. But the university has continued to mismanage every element of their business. They mismanaged the endowment. They've let their administrative expense get completely out of control, and now they're mismanaging their relationship with the university. The wrong thing to do with President Trump is to escalate. Look at what happened with China, where tariffs are. We're now we're in DEFCON, 3, with respect to Harvard. So what did Harvard do? They just they didn't acknowledge anything that was correct in the letter from the administration, and then they turned around and they said definitively no, and then they sued the administration. My view is, and I think this is the view of most Americans, is that the federal government giving taxpayer money to a university is a privilege and not a right. And so what did the Trump administration ask for? They said, look, you need to reduce your administrative bloat, okay? Because, by the way, money is fungible, and maybe we're funding science projects, but effectively we're funding your overhead expense. And you need to bring your overhead expense down. You have to if you're going to take money from the taxpayers, we have to know that there's no waste. And there's massive, massive waste at Harvard. If you look at the compound annual, I did a little PowerPoint buy, sell, or hold on Harvard, which you can find out there. But if you look at the compound annual growth rate and administrative expense and FTEs, full-time equivalents of the administrators versus faculty, the admin expense goes up like this, and the faculty is basically flat. So it's, if you think about this as a business, it's a business where when I graduated from Harvard, there were 1,600 people in my class. And the business of Harvard is educating, that 1,600. Well, if you fast forward to today, the graduating class of 2024 had like 1,640 people in it. Okay, so the university grew 3% over 36 years. Can you tell me of any great business of which you are aware? By the way, that's not a 3% annual compound rate. That's a 3% rate. It's probably it's hard for me to do the math, but it's 0.0 something, 8% compounded annual growth over 40 years. So it's not, and think about the growth in the population over the period. Think about the percentage of foreign students that are going to Harvard now. So this institution, chartered, oldest corporation in America, to educate the future leaders of our country, is educating a tiny fraction of what it was chartered to do, kind of going back in time. And the federal funding to Harvard has continued to increase kind of over this sort of period of time. You've got a CEO who has very little control, i.e. the president, Alan Garber. He's got a workforce that he can't fire, tenure. He's got an endowment that has very little liquidity. And now he's just put himself in a horrible place vis-a-vis the administration, and he's at risk of losing the tax exemption. And so Harvard is in a very bad place. And what they should be doing is they should have immediately engaged with President Trump. We know that his strategy, negotiating strategy, is to ask for, get the headlines with a crazy ask, and then he wants to make a deal. And they should have said, you're right, President Trump, we're hiring Alex Partners, or a restructuring firm, and we're going to do a zero-based budget of what the administrative expense of Harvard should look like. We're going to restructure our organization. You're right, we've done a horrible job protecting students from hate, and allowing pro-terrorist protesters to interfere with education, and we're going to stop it now, and we're going to enforce our code of conduct, which Harvard has not done. Story just in the last week, the member of the, not the faculty, what's the number, kind of the student, like a PhD who teaches students?
Teaching fellow?
Teaching fellow. So there's a teaching fellow that physically attacked a Harvard Business School Jewish student who was walking by the protest. He just got a $65,000 stipend to study something, and he was given a very light. His sentence was 80 hours of community service. So they're not enforcing the rules. I mean, they'll throw someone out of the university and suspend them on the basis of a few too many drinks at a party. So Trump asked for protect your students, eliminate waste, and improve viewpoint diversity at the university. These were the principal asks, and they're entirely reasonable, and it needs to happen, and the university just completely shut it down. So you can argue with President Trump's negotiating strategy. You can say he's over the top, but he's fundamentally right in what he's asking for, and I think the taxpayers should only be funding universities that don't waste money, that have true viewpoint diversity, and create environments that are not anti-Semitic or hate-filled environments.
Yeah, yeah. So Bill, I hear you're short Harvard, but you're long Austin University, because you generously...
With the name change, I'm super long. Yeah.
You generously pledged $10 million to support
Say
our
Austin
university.
University.ai, and then...
Why are you long the renamed Austin University, apart from the renaming?
After this experience with Harvard, I thought, okay, my first reaction is let's try to fix Harvard. We begin with the worst government. I'm a retired activist investor, right? What did I do in my day job? I'd find a great business that lost its way. We'd try to engage with the board and management. If we were unsuccessful, we run a proxy contest, we put a new board in, we recruit new leadership, and we fix the company. Now let's look at Harvard. Harvard has a two-tier board structure. They've got 13 or 12 people in the so-called corporation board. There's no way to run a proxy contest. There's no way to propose a candidate. The corporation board elects itself. Crazy. They have a board of overseers that has about 32 members. They have 6-year terms. The slate is selected by the corporation board. If you want to run for the slate, you used to have to get 600 signatures. They changed that to 3,200 signatures after October 7th. And a couple of very capable alums ran to actually get on the ballot. And they did basically what the Democratic Party did during the most recent election, actually to candidates other than Biden. And they made it effectively impossible. You had to make like 13, you had to go through like 13 windows and call the development office to get your password in order to vote. And still, the leading group, there were 2 leading groups that got 3,100 signatures, 100 short from what was needed, and they didn't allow them on the ballot. So it's like the disastrous kind of, so I even forgot your question, but.
Why are you long? If you're short Harvard,
okay.
Because it's
so
government.
So I started, can I fix Harvard? And I said, no, I can't fix Harvard. The only way to fix Harvard is severe financial pressure. And the good news is the administration is going to bring it on. And that's going to force change. And then I said, well, look, are there any universities doing the right thing? I actually watched one of Neil's fairly inspired speeches from maybe a dinner like this one on YouTube. And that got me interested. And then I came here and I met the students. And you get inspired when you meet a group of young people taking a risk, going to a startup university, because they don't want to repeat the experience they had in high school, where they couldn't say what they thought, where there was cancel culture, DEI, all these various kinds of problems, and they were super, super impressive. And I said, okay, we got to, sometimes the best thing to do is start with a blank sheet of paper. Big fan of the Constitution that was discussed tonight. And love to see this place be enormously successful and then replicate. One of the things we were talking about at dinner is why not have samples of some of the great classes being taught here, get a Hollywood-type producer, multiple cameras, and say, here's what real education looks like, and put these out on YouTube. I can help make them go viral. But ultimately, that's a great way to expand the educational, progress. The biggest negative with Austin University is its small scale, and it's going to take a long time to kind of ramp. But we can have massive, like if we put out, aspiring videos of what it's like to be a student here, applications are going to come in the door. I'm a big believer in competition. If you think about, let's use Harvard. Harvard is basically a bunch of old brick buildings that are not particularly energy efficient. It costs a lot of money to manage. Some land, and faculty and students. Faculty can leave, and the students are already not applying. So a lot of the best students today are applying to other places, applying to UATX, they're applying to Vanderbilt, they're going to Duke. Early admissions are down significantly at Harvard. Early admissions, the best students tend to apply early. And that threat, combined with the financial one, is ultimately going to force change, not just at Harvard, but at other universities.
Okay, I'm going to open this up to the floor for a few questions. There is a roving microphone. It may work. One of the most amazing things about modern technology is that we can do so many things. There's artificial intelligence, large language models, but microphones haven't changed at all in my lifetime. And I would love somebody, maybe an activist investor, should go after microphone companies. Okay, if you have a question, this would be a good time to raise a hand. Don't be shy. This is Austin University.
I can't believe, here we go.
Hi. I'd like your thoughts on whether the government should fund universities at all.
It's a good question. I think the government generally funds scientific research at universities. The problem is money is fungible. And I think, I go back to the point I made before, I think in order to be eligible to receive government funding, even for scientific research, you have to meet certain standards. Certainly, you can't just look at the lab as a silo. You have to look at the entire institution. And what Harvard says is, this is going to lead to a decline in cancer research, Alzheimer research, et cetera, and to scare kind of the public. The reality is, if scientists aren't getting the research funded, they're going to leave Harvard and they're going to go to Duke, or they're going to go to other schools that that the government's going to fund. But I think there's a place for the NIH, there's a place for the National Science Foundation, as long as the money's going to, there's a gap in the capital markets. There are biotechnology venture investors that will invest in startups. There isn't a massive amount of that capital. There's very little capital at the kind of true seed stage of research. And I do think there's a place for government funding. And we've had very good examples, development of the internet, other transformative technologies. A lot of that came from government funding, but it has to be spent efficiently, and it has to go to places that are not causing harm to the country. I think those are perfectly reasonable, and it can't be wasting money. What enables waste at Harvard is the $700 million a year they're getting in funding, and that should stop until they commit to make important changes.
Should Austin University ever accept federal money, or should we remain entirely independent of the government?
I think the ideal is to be independent of the government. Absolutely the ideal. Yeah.
Good. That's my view too, ladies and gentlemen. Are there other questions? There's a hand at the back. I can't see anything but the hand, but we'll take
Harvard is like a kid with a big trust fund who never had to learn how to work. And then all of a sudden, the trust fund was invested in Madoff, and the money disappeared. And it's probably the best thing for the kid, because he's going to have to learn, how to get by. And it is the federal funding and this sort of annuity that came in the door that allowed the proliferation of studies at Harvard and a lot of other degrees that I would say are of questionable merit.
And we are young, scrappy, and hungry by comparison. We're like Hamilton the musical. That's how I like to think of us. Yes, please.
Speaking of debt, have you ever given any thought if you can make student loans, they cannot be canceled? And I sometimes wonder if that fuels that universities can raise the price because they're getting more student debt.
Yes.
And if bankruptcy courts could, cancel that debt, would that improve rising, escalating costs at universities?
Yes. So a couple of thoughts. By the way, if you want to look where the massive inflation is in America. It's in healthcare, government subsidy, and it's in university education, massive subsidy. And by the way, think about all the subsidies that Harvard is getting. It's not just, of course, direct government funding. It's not just the tax exemption, right? My view is you have a tax exemption, you're a fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayer, because it means that it's being paid for. And if every student can afford to go because they can access, a loan, then there's no limit on the price you can charge. So your point is right. That being said, I think we should have, I think it makes sense to have some government involvement in student lending, but I would do the following. I would require the university to be the first loss lender. So imagine a $100,000 student loan. The university has to be the credit support. They've got to be the junior most $10,000 or $15,000 of the loan. And then they have to be very thoughtful, right? Because they lose the first dollar if the student can't repay. And I think student loans should be dischargeable in bankruptcy, but maybe by the time you turn 40. The logic behind making them not dischargeable, the theory was a student would borrow the money and then would graduate and then would just file for bankruptcy and just to clear their debt. So there was a logic to making them non-dischargeable. My argument is by the time you're 40, if you haven't been able to pay down your student debt or whatever, and don't have a good, successful career, obviously your education didn't help you, and the bankruptcy court seems like an appropriate place for you to go to have a restart. And no one, of course, would, borrow the money with an expectation of defaulting in 18 years. So I think there are a number of changes you could make to student lending that would have a very dramatic effect. But I think the most important is for the university to have skin in the game. It's like a mortgage. The university should be the equity investor, and fine, let the taxpayer be a senior lender to the students. And that would immediately discipline what's going on in terms of how resources are being allocated. And all of a sudden the university is going to say, okay, you're going to major in this, you're going to major in gender studies, explain to me how you're going to repay the loan. So that would be my suggestion.
Once you've sorted out the trade war, maybe you can get onto the president about that, because these are great ideas. We'll take one more question, and then I think we should let Bill get to his dessert. I see an arm.
I'm happy to do, I got all night, so if you have good questions, I have hopefully good answers.
I saw an arm right at the very back, just then.
Mr. Ackman, thank you so much for being here tonight and for being generous with your time. I actually want to revisit your answer to the first question. You'd mentioned that it's ideal for a university to not be reliant on government funding. I agree with that as an ideal standard, but I'm curious, as a STEM professor here, how can we compete with the sort of money the NIH hands out as an independent university?
I said ideal, but we don't live in an ideal world. What you want is a university that you don't want an administration. You go from Republican to Democrat, and as we go back and forth over time, and that can affect. Where Harvard was right to push back is the government shouldn't be dictating what can be taught. They cannot impair academic freedom. But the reality of Harvard is there is no, academic freedom is in deep question. Free speech is obviously questionable. I think the government can insist on academic freedom, free speech, a safe environment for students, no support for terrorism. So I think a government can insist on these standards in order to provide funding. Now, our competitors and our adversaries, use a lot of government resources to compete with us. I think we have not yet solved the problem of early stage STEM-related research. Look, my view on philanthropy is you save philanthropy for gaps in the capital markets, right? If there's a for-profit solution to a problem, you fund the startup or the for-profit business. You reserve philanthropic capital for places where there are gaps, and the same thing's true for government resources. You only deploy government resources if there isn't a capitalist or a for-profit solution to the problem. And I do think kind of early stage scientific research is sort of too far away for the venture capitalist, if you will. So that's why I said the ideal world is we have no government funding. But I think you could enshrine these basic principles in order to get government funding, and you could cement them in such a way that the next administration, or maybe 100 years from now when there's a Democratic administration reelected, you could be protected from an overreach from the left.
But when you say that, I can't help wondering if maybe that's a slightly outmoded way of thinking about it. When you consider where the advances have come from in, say, artificial intelligence, as well as in some of the areas in genetics, a lot of that has not come from government funding in recent years. The enormous pools of capital that the big technology companies have created seem to me to have altered the world. And the world when the government had to fund the research is sort of the Cold War world, the Manhattan Project world. Haven't we left that by?
Yeah, I don't agree. So we fund a fair amount of scientific research, and the best work is coming out of universities, sort of dedicated research institutes like Salk and Cold Spring Harbor, and I'm sure many other such examples. Yes, the government shouldn't be funding research that's already being funded by the private sector. But there's sort of basic scientific research. Some of our, I forgot the proper name, like not big tech, but deep tech. Deep tech. There's a very limited amount of private capital going into deep tech because it's hard for investors. The capital has become increasingly short-term, and these are the startup to realization. For a biotech idea, it's probably at least 12 to 15 years typically. So I do think there is a place for government funding, but you have to meet certain standards in order to receive the funds.
I don't want to outstay our welcome on this stage, knowing that you're jet lagged and they're still waiting for dessert.
He's trying to throw me off the stage.
No,
it's like I did something wrong. I'm
a late night guy too, Bill. But not everybody in the United States.
I certainly don't want to keep people at dinner.
In California, they're all heading for bed.
I'm taking over the panel. That's what an activist does. I do want to take whatever questions there are, and then we'll go home. There's one in the back there. I'm now going to pick the question. Shh.
All right. I'm Nicola Dimasi.
Has anyone ever said shh to Neil?
It has been tried before. Shh. And my wife is usually the person who does this, but it's okay.
All right. I'm Nicola Dimasi, Neil. I run the largest public company in the quantum computing space, and Neil knows me relatively well. I've timed this to be one of the last questions, if not the last one, which is I'd be interested in both of your thoughts, and I thank you both for being here, on what you're excited about on the roadmap of UATX or Austin University. What's upcoming that we should all be looking for that does lead the way and shine the light?
Well, I think we've talked tonight about the next step in our leadership. And with Carlos, I think we have a fantastic opportunity to explain to peers of Bill what it is that we're building here that is unique. I mean, centers for civics are all very well and good, but if they're embedded in established legacy universities, you're never going to get the kind of revolution that Pano was talking about. We're the only game in town if you really want to transform higher education, rather than put a fig leaf on the sins of the established institutions. That's number one. Number two is, I think we need to establish ourselves in the next 5 years as world leaders in a couple of fields. And that's a really important next step. We've laid an intellectual foundation. We've created the best freshman program in the United States, if not the world. Credit to Jake Howland for the vision that he has brought to that. But that's just the beginning. The exciting thing that lies ahead over the coming years is that we get to fill out our entire curriculum, but we have to choose. We can't do everything. Particle accelerators, I don't think we're going to have one of those for a while. So the next big question, and it's a question for Carlos as our president-elect, is where are we going to be world leaders? And where, therefore, are we going to be able to attract world-leading faculty and world-leading students? Because that's how a university puts itself on the map and starts being able to compete with the legacy institutions for talent. So I think that's another hugely exciting thing. And I'll give you one more, Nicolo. I think what Bill alluded to earlier, the way in which once we have built this incredible elite institution, producing the Navy SEALs of the mind, our next step is to let the world know about the quality of content that we are producing. I have never believed, and I will continue to dispute, that there can be purely virtual universities. But I do think that if you build an elite institution, it is now possible to scale that by making at least some of the content available to the rest of the world. And with the help of artificial intelligence, you can do more than just post your lectures as videos. You can start engaging with people and allowing them to learn. It'll never be as good as the real thing. The premium product will always be right here on our campus.
Well, why can't we just make a Neil Ferguson bot so you can watch the virtual class, you can watch the actual class and the students interact and everything else?
I am the bot. No, the real guy is not here.
But in all seriousness, and then the virtual student can have a AI Neil professor to work with.
You see, this is not a joke. It's real. Carlos already built the Milton Friedman bot. If you want to get cured of Paul Krugman, you go to the Milton Friedman bot. And in truth, there is an alarming plan to create a Neil Ferguson bot. There's a brilliant young guy who's been talking my hind legs off, trying to get me to agree to let him go live with all the content I've ever produced and his bot. Now, having a bust of yourself is one thing. It's not a bad likeness. It's got the furrowed brow, but it doesn't talk back at me. The nightmare of another me talking potentially at me is one I have not fully reconciled myself to. So we can do this.
You do that every day in the mirror in the morning.
I don't talk to myself in the mirror. Maybe you do, Bill, but I think that would be a bad sign. Are you done, or do you want to have another question? I don't think you're done.
There's a question, and I take it.
there.
Here's one here.
Thanks, everybody. Bill, can I pitch you on a trade?
I think it seems off market, but go ahead.
Okay, so
But we got to give an opportunity for people to make money so they can give more to the university.
yes. All right, tell me anything about this. So Harvard potentially could default on the debt if they lose tax exempt status, or could they?
I mean, you're saying if Harvard defaults because of loss of tax exempt status?
Right.
I don't think there's no covenant to that effect.
Okay. Well, then my trade probably doesn't make sense. I was going to pitch you on buying their debt. They default.
That sounds like the worst idea I've ever heard.
All right. Next question.
Well,
Are we done? No, again, happy to take questions right here.
the president-elect has a question. Or
Who's got the mic? Go ahead.
Okay.
So, gentlemen, hello. Thank you for all this. So we've had so speaking from inside UATX, we've had absolutely enormous interest from foreign nationals. There's people outside the U.S. As difficult as it has been with universities here in the United States, there's also deep problems with universities in England, for example, or Australia, as I'm sure Neil can attest. So, what are your thoughts about the pros and cons of that? For example, there's been big controversy about H-1B visas. Should we try to prioritize American citizens? Should we try to sort of bring our mission to the Anglophone world? How should we approach this question of this enormous demand from people all around the world who want to come to Austin University?
So, look, I think the benefit of being educated alongside foreign students is you build relationships, you learn about other cultures, other countries. I think at this stage of this tiny institution, I think we have to favor, Americans. And I don't think we should, I think we lose something if we have a meaningful, foreign student component. I think we're raising resources from, again, if you think about foreign students going to Harvard, right? The taxpayer is funding a foreign student taking the place of an American student going to Harvard University. It just doesn't sound right to me. I asked the question you should say is, what would the taxpayers say? I think there's a real argument, a real question about what, the pretty high percentage of students today that are foreign, that go to our elite universities, that have been subsidized by taxpayers and principally charitable donations given by Americans. So,
Of course, under the present constraints imposed by accreditation, we cannot admit non-US students, so we don't have that option. That may change, but I think you're right that one wouldn't want to end up in the situation of some British universities, like the London School of Economics, where the majority of students are non-UK students. I taught a class as a visiting professor at the London School of Economics recently in which there were no UK students, not one in the classroom. And I think that can't be right. I suspect we may have reached the end of this
I had a question.
conversation.
I had
the president-elect has the microphone. Well, we definitely have to hear from him last. Carlos.
It's a follow-up on the question about student loans. Right now, all tuition is being waived via scholarships, and the students are, of course, that makes it very attractive. At some point soon, in the near future, we're going to need to start bringing some tuition revenue. And if we don't have federal supported funds through student loans, that's going to be difficult. So my question is, do you think there's an opportunity for fill that backing that currently is done by the taxpayer? Let's say the idea of doing, we are equity investors in the student, but instead of having the government being the backer, philanthropy being the backer, which, I go to you, say, I'm not asking for money right now, I'm just asking for the guarantee for the student that I believe in. Do you think that would be an attractive proposition to a number of folks in this room and, around the world when we go pitch to it?
actually, I think I think Austin University is extremely well positioned to get federal funding in light of the principles and everything else, and particularly from this administration. So I think that is, particularly at our early stage, I'd rather save philanthropy for stuff we can't get from the federal government. But I do think we're well positioned. But you could certainly see a world in which, you could have an alum or a supporter of a university say, look, I'm going to be the equity behind students who pursue engineering degrees or science degrees, or if they feel strongly, or philosophy or whatever. I like the idea, but I want the institution itself to have skin in the game.
No, that's what I'm saying. We are the equity. We are issuing the debt in some sort of share of that risk between us and so the student is going to pay back part of their revenue later on, but we are making the loan. It's just that the backing of the loan to some degree, to some extent, right, is a shared thing between the university and the philanthropist.
Yeah, again, as long as you can have a donor split the risk, but I do, you can't get a Fannie Mae loan unless someone puts down a 20% deposit or they have mortgage insurance. It's kind of a similar thing. You want to have, and by the way, you want the student to have skin in the game. Right, and the problem we have is you're 18 years old, and you get a bunch of paper. You get emailed a form. And you're like, sign here, and you can attend the school. And you haven't had any basic finance education in high school, and you don't really understand the implications of signing up for a non-dischargeable loan. Maybe today more so, but the other thing that's completely wrong. I have a bunch of ideas on student loans. I wrote a long tweet on it a while ago. But the notion that you weren't able to refinance student loans in a lower interest rate environment, and the government, when rates went to zero, we were still charging students 7 or 8%. That to me seems entirely wrong. And so I think an appropriate thing to do, I'm not a believer in wiping out student loans, But I think it would have been appropriate to give students, and people today that have outstanding student balances, the benefit if they got effectively the loan readjusted and you had the ability to refinance when rates were really low. And that would make the burden meaningfully less.
One of the things that's exciting about this conversation, ladies and gentlemen, is that you can hear us sitting here trying to reinvent the financing of higher education. And it's very clear for the conversation that we've had about Harvard that we do have to reinvent it. Because success would not be for us to end up one day like Harvard with all the pathologies that have been revealed. So Bill, I want to thank you for supporting us.
He's trying to shut me up again.
I
have one last thought, and and then I'll shut up. Why does Harvard have so many foreign students? Because foreign students don't get financial aid. They pay the full ride, and that allows them to access funding from Qatar, funding from other countries, and that's led us down a very dangerous road. So just something we thought about.
Yeah, I entirely agree. Bill, thank you so much for giving us your time.